Hi class. Audrey and I are going to go through our case presentation with you today. Okay, so first things first, our client's main presenting problem is his addiction. So we're going to run through this very upbeat video on addiction so that we're on the same level when we get started.
Say the word addiction, and drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and cocaine often come to mind. But other substances like nicotine, marijuana, and prescription pain medications can also be addictive. So can certain activities such as gambling and sex. Whatever the case, addiction involves craving and a loss of control, with the substance use or activity continuing even if it causes harm. This can include problems with relationships, jobs, school, money, or your health. Addiction is not due to weakness or a lack of willpower. Instead, it's a chronic disease involving changes in the brain. There, billions of nerve cells or neurons communicate through a series of signals and chemical messengers. When messages leave one neuron, they attach to a receptor on the receiving one, like a key fitting into a lock. In addiction, this communication process is disrupted. Large amounts of a brain chemical called dopamine are released, overwhelming receptors and resulting in the high that people experience. To keep that feeling going, they take the drug or engage in the behavior again and again. Eventually, the brain changes and adapts, driving them to seek out more just to get the same feeling. That's called tolerance. Stopping a substance can cause withdrawal symptoms such as nausea, tremors, depression, or severe anxiety. Taking too much of a substance or a combination of substances can result in an overdose and serious illness, or even death. Young people are especially vulnerable to addiction. The impulse control center of their brains, known as the prefrontal cortex, isn't fully developed, making them more prone to risky behavior. And using substances can cause lasting harm to their developing brains. If you think your child might be experimenting with substances, talk to them about it. Parents can help by taking a strong stand against substance use and teaching their kids healthier ways to deal with life's stresses. Like any other disease, such as diabetes or asthma, addiction can be successfully treated. So if you or someone you know has a problem with addiction, talk to your doctor, a mental health professional, or an addiction specialist. Getting help may save a life.
Alrighty, so the video talked about cravings. Now, our client doesn't have a loss of control. He's been sober for 6 months, but he does still experience a lot of cravings. So for him, he feels like he needs stimulants, kratom especially. We're going to get into what kratom is later, but he feels like he needs these drugs in order to succeed in life because that's what he's used to. And that's where his dopamine reward is coming from. So instead of, eating well or going out and exercising, he wants kratom in order to feel better. So the definitions that go with his cravings are that it's a state where the person is focused on acquiring the drug. So he's thinking about this a lot. Where can I get this if I decided to get up and give it? The next one is the desire to use a drug given the opportunity. So he's in school now, so studying, he really feels like he needs this drug to focus while he's studying for school. And then, of course, the psychological want for the positive effects of the drug. Kratom makes him feel better. It helps him focus. It makes him feel like his old self. So all of these thoughts are what we call irrational thoughts. So that's one of the things that Audrey and I are going to focus on in our presentation and our treatment for him is that when he's thinking things like, I need kratom to study, this is an irrational thought. And our response is something along the lines of, but you've been studying without it for 6 months and you're doing just fine in school. No, you don't need kratom to study. All right, next slide.
So the client, he is a 23-year-old white male studying undergrad at Appalachian State. He transferred in 2018 after dropping out of school at UNC Asheville. He studies music industry. He also plays in a band and produces his own solo music. So music is something that he values most in life. The client, he's been seeking recovery support services at the Appalachian Collegiate Recovery Community, which is where my field placement is, since the fall 2020 semester. So he wasn't technically referred to us. He just Googled Appalachian State Substance Help, and he found the CRC the day that he chose to be sober. So he met with my supervisor, who referred him to see maybe like attend our support groups that we host weekly. So he's been attending those, and I've also been meeting with him one-on-one for peer support since about late October. And he has been seeing my supervisor regularly, which I'll get to. Okay, so clearly the client has a history with substance use, which is really important to know going into this, the treatment plan. He started drinking and smoking marijuana in about 8th or 9th grade. He described his behavior as messing around with opiates and psychedelics throughout high school. And in college, he started using stimulant medications like Adderall and Vyvanse, and also kratom, which I'll explain in a second. And then he would also use marijuana or alcohol and other downers to take the edge off. And he says he would take anything he could get his hands on, really. And he's been sober since September 30th, 2020. So it's almost 6 months, and we're really happy because that is a place that he didn't think he could get to. So anyway. So the client, like we've been saying, he's experiencing significant cravings for kratom and prescription stimulants for the past few weeks, although he's described it as chronic in nature. So lately he's just been really disorganized with school. He feels like he's not planning his time well, and he's not prioritizing school as much. And so that's kind of where the cravings have been coming up more. And for those of you who don't know, kratom is an herbal plant that is native to Southeast Asia, and it has opioid properties and has some stimulant-like effects. So it's a natural stimulant, basically. It's federally legal in the US, but some states like Arkansas and Tennessee, they have listed it as a controlled substance, and some have listed as a Schedule 1. Kratom's used recreationally as a medicine, and it can be bought in like tobacco stores, but it's not legally marketed in the US as a drug or a dietary supplement. So it's not being regulated, really. The client explained how he used to not be able to do anything without stimulants, and the problem is currently manifested in school. So he's been experiencing a lot of brain fog, attention disruptions. He says he can only really work on things for like 5 minutes at a time, and disorganized thoughts. So the client is aware of his rights, and he believes his needs are being met. The client has experienced stigmatization within his friend group, where some have stopped talking to him after learning about his recovery journey. So that is, an issue that he described with me. Previous counseling experience, he had started seeing a therapist for anxiety and depression in high school. And he's been seeing that therapist on and off, but he says that he doesn't really understand substance abuse. So he was able to talk to him about, his organizing school stuff and how that relates to his anxiety, but he wasn't really able to talk with him much about his substance abuse problems. He's currently attending weekly counseling sessions through the Department of Wellness and Prevention Services, which is where the CRC is located. And this is, again, my supervisor who he's been seeing weekly. In 2017, the client checked himself into a mental health facility in Asheville, but he was only there for a few hours. He says it's because he really didn't see it helping him, and he was just struggling. It was a really bad point in his life. So he did make an effort, but it was unsuccessful. Cultural history. The client grew up in North Carolina, and he identifies closely with the Boone community. He grew up in Apex, but once moving to Boone, he's been feeling like this is like his home. He did not specify identifying with a certain culture. The client believes in God, but he does not identify with a specific religion. He used to identify as an atheist, but explained how praying has been really helpful in his recovery journey. He believes praying and vocalizing his gratitude has kept him grounded. So he used to not pray, and then he found himself praying and was like, oh, wow, I guess I do believe in God. And so he kind of shifted his spiritual beliefs more, but not identifying with a certain religion. So the client identifies a major strength of his to be his hard work ethic. He's also really resilient in the face of personal challenges and has great motivation to achieve in school and in recovery. So although he is, stressed out about school right now, he does want to succeed because music is something that's very passionate to him, and he wants to be able to, work in the music industry after he graduates. And recovery has just been something he's been super resilient about because it's not been easy, but as as I've talked about, because he's been having previous attempts. So this is his first successful attempt. And the client is more open about himself and his challenges than he was before his recovery. So he's been really open and honest about his cravings, about the issues he's been experiencing in recovery, which he says is something he never used to do. He said he just liked to hide his emotions and hide his feelings. And that's allowed for significant growth, being able to be more open. So his dad and mom, they were both born in 1964. The dad was adopted as a young child, and he married the client's mother in 1984. He does not have a history with substance misuse, but he has experienced depression. And to the client's knowledge, he did not receive clinical help for this, but he did communicate that he was experiencing some depressive symptoms at one point. And his dad is also unaware of the client being in recovery. His mom also does not have a history with substance misuse, and she does not have a history with mental illness. And she is also unaware of the client being in recovery. He says his parents, there's no specific reason for not communicating it with his parents, besides they caught him in high school with some marijuana and they freaked out, quote unquote. And so he decided to keep his recovery and anything relating to drugs from them just because of that reaction. But it's not because he's scared of a lack of support. It's really just, he just doesn't feel comfortable talking about drugs with them. His sister is 21, and she's also started school at UNC Asheville, but dropped out. She's currently living at home with both their parents. She, according to the client, struggles with mental health problems, including anxiety and depression. The client is unsure if she's seeing a therapist or getting any sort of counseling help, and he explained how they're not really close. But the sister is aware of him being in recovery, so he feels comfortable communicating that with her. So I met with the client over Zoom. He was well-groomed and appeared approximately his stated age. He wore a gray sweatshirt with a black beanie. He was cooperative with answering questions and maintained a positive attitude. The client swiveled around in his seat and played with his headphones during the interview. He's normally a pretty fidgety guy, so it really wasn't a surprise. His affect was appropriate and normal in response to speech content. He rated his current mood as a 5 on a 0 to 10 scale, stating, "I'm just anxious all the time." His speech was normal, but sometimes pressured. Sometimes he'd talk really fast and then he'd kind of slow down. His thoughts generally flowed logically, but were sometimes disorganized. He was oriented to time, place, and person. His remote, recent, and immediate memory appeared intact, and he appeared to be reliable and honest, and his insight and judgment were good.
All right, so let's dig into the diagnoses. We have 3 for our client that we came up with. So our first is the stimulant use disorder. He qualifies as severe for other or unspecified stimulant, in our case, kratom. And then he's in early remission because he's been sober for 6 months. Now, the reason our client qualifies as severe is he has cravings. He's made previous attempts to stop. He's made a lot of effort to locate stimulants for himself. His tolerance has increased over time, and he has continued use despite suffering negative consequences. So not attending class, it worsened his depression. And then he experienced withdrawal symptoms after cessation of use. So he started drinking and smoking weed in 8th or 9th grade, and then he messed around with opiates and psychedelics throughout high school. In college is when he really started to use stimulants in order to keep up with studying. And then he, as Audrey already said, he would then take downers to take the edge off. So he would go up, he'd get too high, couldn't sleep. So then he'd drink or smoke to come back down again. And then he's still drinking excessively, and he's still taking psychedelics in college. In his words, it was just kind of whatever I could get my hands on. So with kratom, he was also Adderall and Vyvanse. Keep that in mind as he was buying from his friends who had prescriptions for it. So second diagnosis is generalized anxiety disorder with panic attacks. The client described himself as just being an anxious kid. So he's always had anxiety, but it got worse once drugs were added into the mix. So his symptoms with his anxiety is he feels paranoid going outside or driving. He quote unquote felt on edge everywhere, just felt like something bad was going to happen always. He's shaky, he'd pace around, he'd have rapid thoughts, and amplified thinking. So, amplified thinking meaning he'd read a math problem, and instead of it just being read in a normal voice, he would hear the words screaming in his head. His panic attacks started his freshman year of college. And they also first started when he started smoking weed. So he describes his panic attacks as being substance related, and that they felt like a complete outer body experience, sort of a mind body disconnect. He would get tunnel vision, like looking through a straw, and that his hearing would be impaired as well. So all of this would be happening, and he couldn't hear things, or they'd be very, very muffled during his panic attacks. Reading my notes. Okay, so last one, other substance, cannabis-induced depressive disorder with onset during withdrawal. Now this one's a little complicated, but essentially the client describes his depression is not occurring until after he started smoking cannabis, same with those panic attacks. So it would appear that a lot of his issues dwell straight from drug use. So he said his depression started around 19 after he started smoking marijuana, and that it was never present beforehand. And his symptoms for depression were he had no hope for the future. He just generally felt sad, negative thoughts in the world. He thought about death a lot. He never made plans. There was no suicide ideation. He just generally thought about death. He had no motivation. He was tired all the time. And he really felt depressed most of the time until about 21. And then he himself believes that drugs were the cause of his depression. Next. All right, so our treatment plan for him, we have two goals. The first is that the client will create a safety plan to use when experiencing his cravings. So our objectives for those is he's going to identify situations or conditions that trigger his cravings so he can be aware of those. Second one, client will identify at least one person that they can ask for help when experiencing cravings. When you're dealing with addiction, you truly cannot deal with it alone. You need outside resources always. Objective 3, client will identify at least 3 activities they can do anywhere, anytime within his comfort zone to distract himself when experiencing cravings. So whenever those cravings start to bubble up with whatever it is that he's doing, he's going to have a plan he can take a hot shower, he can watch an episode of something that brings him joy, he can clean, he can go outside, he can do an exercise. He's going to come up with things that are going to bring him dopamine in a different way. Okay. Our second goal is the client will learn to think more positively. So cravings are tied to irrational beliefs, as we mentioned before. So first objective, the client will develop 3 tools and techniques to identify their irrational thoughts. So in our case, our client often says, I need kratom to study. I need Adderall to study. Like I can't focus. I need these things to help me study. So a counteract to that would be, but you've been studying without it for 6 months and you're doing fine in school. So he's going to develop tools and techniques for himself when we're not there to counteract those irrational thoughts. Second one is client will develop at least 3 skills or techniques to use to dispute the irrational thoughts when they occur outside of therapy. So step 1, identify those thoughts. Know when they're happening. No, I don't need kratom to study. I've been doing it. The second objective is how do we push those irrational thoughts aside so that you can do the thing that you think you can't do without it. Okay. All right, so our evaluation tools for our treatment, we picked out 2. So the Zung self-rating depression scale, the clients rate themselves, and it's completed weekly to every several days. Audrey, go ahead and click on that link so you guys can see it for yourself. It looks a lot like what we did in Dr. Ben's class. So it's very simple, just statements. I have trouble sleeping at night. I eat as much as I used to. I notice that I'm losing weight a little of the time, some of the time, good part of the time, most of the time. And then they submit that, and we're going to keep track of those weekly to see how he's doing. Our second one is a questionnaire smoking urges. Now, our client doesn't smoke. However, the smoking urges is just a questionnaire on cravings. So we're going to modify that to use as a behavioral measure. So it's on a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree. So our examples of modification are, I have a desire to engage in substance use right now. It used to say, I have a desire to smoke right now, right? And so he strongly agrees, strongly disagrees, somewhere in the middle. Engaging in substance use would make me less depressed right now. Strongly agree, strongly disagree, somewhere in the middle. So that's how we're going to keep track of his cravings to see if they ease over time. Okay, so going back to those irrational thoughts, we are going to use a method called rational emotive behavioral therapy, REBT. So it was introduced in 1955 by Dr. Ellis. So the whole point of it is to focus on being aware of your irrational thoughts and then getting rid of them. Dr. Ellis believed in 1955 that these irrational thoughts are a result of biological processes. We've since then kind of moved past that. It's definitely not just biological, nature versus nurture and all that. Because when he originally developed it, he thought that if you have rational thoughts, you will always have them. But we know that that's not the case. Next. All right, so we're going to show y'all about 2 minutes of a role play. These are 2 students and it's a scripted role play, but Audrey and I decided, why would we reinvent the wheel if someone else already did it well?
Carlos is a junior in high school. This is his second session with the counselor. Rapport has been established. He has been referred by the wrestling coach due to having a negative attitude and talking negatively about himself. This counseling session is using the REBT counseling theory. Hello, Carlos. How are you doing today?
Feeling terrible. I had a wrestling match last night and I lost my match again. I should just quit the team. I'm such a bad wrestler.
What do you mean by again?
I lost my match last week too. I should just quit the team.
You mean because you lost 2 matches, it automatically means you're going to lose your next match?
Well, yes. I am clearly a bad wrestler.
Okay, so losing is not fun. No one likes to lose, but it doesn't mean you're a bad wrestler.
Yeah, I guess not. But all my other teammates won their matches. It made me feel dumb to be the only one who lost. Like I'm a terrible wrestler. I don't feel like I belong on the team anymore.
Yes, losing is unpleasant, and those 2 matches weren't your best. Does that mean that you're a bad wrestler?
Well, I don't know. Maybe not.
How are you doing before you lost those 2 matches?
We've only had 4 matches so far, but I won my first 2 matches.
Okay, so you started off the season by winning 2 matches in a row, which means you do know how to wrestle. You just happened to lose 2 matches in a row, but that's all it was.
Yeah.
What else are you telling yourself about wrestling?
Well, I just felt terrible after I lost those 2 matches, and I was thinking that if I lose my next match, I'm never going to be able to get a scholarship to college.
Hold on a second, Carlos. Let me stop you right there. What if you do lose your next match? What is the worst thing that could happen? Would it be the end of the world?
No, I guess not. The season just started.
How much longer do you have in the season?
A few more months.
A few more months, which means you still have plenty of matches left. So although losing your next match would be frustrating, you would be okay. The world would not end.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
Do you enjoy wrestling?
All right, so in the video, our clinician, played by the gal in the yellow cardigan, her whole job was to dispute dispute his irrational thoughts. So his irrational thoughts were, oh, I'm a terrible wrestler because I lost 2 matches. I'm never going to get a scholarship to college now. Like, I don't deserve to be a wrestler. I should just quit. Those were all irrational beliefs, and she disputed each and every one of them. She basically just asked him, is there any evidence that what you said is true? So that's what REBT is all about, is disputing those irrational thoughts. And they do this by breaking it down into something called the ABCs. So A is your activating event. So for Carlos, his activating event was that he lost a match. His belief about that event, B, is that he'll never get into college now. And his C, his consequent emotions, were that he just felt really down on himself, really bad, and then that showed by acting out to his coach and being really negative and talking back. So her job as the clinician was to break those down, and we're going to do the same thing with our client. So you're looking for beliefs. So our client is going to have beliefs about themselves. His is, I have to use kratom in order to do well in school. Well, let's dispute that. That's not true, because you've been studying without kratom for 6 months and you're doing fine. His beliefs about others. My friends won't like me if I hang out with them sober. Now this stemmed from when he told his friends he was in recovery and they didn't want to hang out with him before. Let's dispute that belief. It's not because he was going to be sober, it's because there's a stigmatization against recovery and drug use and addiction in our society as a whole. Beliefs about conditions of the world. It's impossible not to use drugs to get through life. To dispute that, hey, that's not true. Lots of people don't use drugs and they get through life just fine. Yeah, next.
So one recommended macro intervention we have, is building a community-based prevention infrastructure. So steps to implement this. The first and most important is to form a community coalition. Community coalitions have been shown to improve community capacity for effective prevention. They've shown to increase dissemination, implementation, and sustainability of EBIs. And they've shown to produce community-wide reductions in youth substance use. So through community coalitions, we see, the key really to helping reduce substance use and misuse is to build a prevention infrastructure at the local level through these community coalitions. This means increasing awareness of evidence-based interventions among community leaders, service providers, and local citizens, as well as providing tools to help these systems and agencies choose and use feasible and relevant evidence-based interventions. So that's kind of what community coalitions will help do. The second, after you form your coalition, second step is to conduct a needs assessment, a resource assessment, and a fit assessment. So these will help the coalitions select the right evidence-based interventions for their community. The needs assessment collects data on levels of substance use, risk and protective factors relating to substance use, as well as elevated risk factors and depressed protective factors. And these are all going to be targets for the evidence-based interventions to address. The resource assessment, it assesses current prevention programming that's already been in place in the community, seeing what risk and protective factors they've already been addressing, the numbers and types of populations they've been serving, and also the quality of the current intervention. And then the fit assessment, it assesses the fit of the new EBIs in the local community or evidence-based interventions. The next step is to assess local readiness and capacity. So this means identifying the organizations and agencies that will deliver the new evidence-based interventions, assessing the level of support for each new evidence-based intervention among key personnel, like the people at the agencies that will be implementing them, and also identifying the financial and human resources and all other requirements necessary to implement each evidence-based intervention, because each intervention does have certain requirements that the community and the agencies are expected to meet in order for them to be successfully implemented. The next is to select the intervention or interventions that is the best fit for the community. So these are the ones that are most likely to be fully supported, meet prioritized needs, are culturally relevant, can be well implemented, and can be sustained over the long term. The sustainability is a really big piece here. So the next step is to enhance the implementation fidelity and implementers' capacity. So this means supporting these local agencies to ensure that they're hiring accredited and experienced staff, and also that they're getting trained in, to utilize these evidence-based interventions, and that training is, you know, like proper training, not just a short little, hey, this is how you do it. And then the final step is to plan for long-term sustainability. So it's important for agencies and communities just to consider how each evidence-based intervention will be integrated into the existing client system. So in this case, people in treatment for substance misuse and substance use disorders, and how it's going to be, how those interventions are going to be funded over the long term. So a quote that I really liked from the resource that I got all this information from that kind of sums it up. When local systems and agencies learn more about the effectiveness of prevention interventions, have a culture and climate that supports innovation and the use of evidence-based interventions, and have the budget and skills needed to plan for and monitor the implementation of evidence-based interventions, then effective dissemination and implementation will be fostered. So basically for our client, if building like prevention efforts from a community level, meaning the community is all on board with supporting substance use prevention and is engaging in, you know, and taking action on it. So like forming coalitions and trying to get these agencies and organizations to implement certain interventions. Seeing that support will better support the client as well as other people who are in recovery. So an ethical issue is a right to self-determination. So if the client does have a problem coming up with his safety plan, or, you know, ways he can challenge or dispute irrational beliefs, we are ethically required as social workers to respect his autonomy. So we cannot provide any guidance or recommendations for him, even if we have our own ideas of what will be helpful. So when we are, you know, during the REBT process, we are introducing ways to challenge irrational beliefs, but there's a line, like I can't really give him recommendations on how he can dispute them, especially like outside of therapy. And when he's coming up with a safety plan and ways that he can, what things that he can do, that will be challenging because like I've been saying, I've been seeing him for peer support. So I haven't really been seeing him in a clinical setting. So I've been able to give him some advice whenever he asks me for some, but in, you know, using an evidence-based intervention in a clinical setting, I would not be allowed to do that. So it'd be really, like, it'd be kind of challenging, and that's just an ethical issue to consider. So, self-reflections. For me, this was awesome. I really enjoyed this, especially, I mean, because it's someone I serve, but I have been seeing him for just peer support, so it's been really casual. So looking at the issues he's been talking with me about at a more clinical level and seeing what sort of treatment would help him was really awesome to learn about. We've been using a smart recovery. Smart recovery is like the pathway we've been using. What is it? The recovery tool that we've been using during our group support meetings. So, and that's kind of, REBT is integrated into it, but seeing it as a separate entity, it's not something we really like do in the group meetings like ours. So seeing it like separately and how it would work for him has been awesome.
So for me, I think the biggest learning point in this was going through the DSM and getting our diagnoses for him correct. So we spent so much time, especially on the stimulant use disorder, nitpicking through it and making sure we got it correct. And then the depression induced through cannabis disorders. And I learned so much, and how careful and considerate and nitpicky you really have to be when you're signing a diagnosis to someone, because it's going to stick for quite a while. And if you most certainly, you don't want to get it wrong, because if you do, then their treatments are going to be off and they're just not going to get the help that they need. So I learned a lot through doing that, and I really enjoyed it. I also learned a lot through looking up interventions for addictions. And our REBT, I'd never heard of it before, and I think it's so effective and so amazing. And just like realizing that cravings are irrational beliefs. I'd never thought about that before, but they are, and it suits a lot of different things. And so I enjoyed learning about different further interventions that I could use down the line with my own clients.
And also relating back to the diagnosis, diagnosing someone who has a substance use disorder is so challenging. And I can see it, especially because he said he never really had a problem with alcohol, but it was definitely something that he did a lot. And so now, or he did drink a lot. He didn't really identify it as a main concern though. So like, that's why we focused it on stimulants. But initially we had like other substance related disorder. So like seeing like the fine lines was really interesting. Like it's really hard to nitpick a certain diagnosis for substance use disorders because some people engage in multiple substances. But I think from what I learned, you got to pay attention to what was causing the problem. So stimulants in his case were what was causing the problems for him. But yeah, and the next is our references.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.